Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Machine Lies, Holy Robots, where we explore the dialectic, the ever-growing dialectic that is being framed between science and religion. Now, here on Machine Lies, we'd like to explore the main facets of the problem of technology, and we do so in various ways and means, but we find that not only is the myth of science technological, which means that whenever we see science fiction, we see it explore the cutting edge technology of science, and we see that, the modern world itself is sort of a dialectic between science and art. where science is posed against art. Art is the human creativity, and science is the cold, hard facts of the matter, the actual objective power, the reification of knowledge as it is. And it seems like the perfect thing that sort of forms a synthesis between science on the one end and art on the other end is technique itself. Because see, technique is the thing that is both art and science. Because technique in one sense is skill, but in another sense it's the methodology we use for the scientific endeavor. So we find that there's not an appropriate dialectic in the modern world between science and art, because these two things are in some way merged within the creative enterprise, within technique itself. And we find that the myth of science is technological, as we've stated earlier. And we open this show here, Holy Robots, to explore this dialectic. And we find that this dialectic is sort of talked about in many different areas. But here is the dialectic of science and religion. Now, not only is the myth of science technological, but the myth of religion seems to be utterly spiritual or mystical, or even cosmological in some sense. And we find this explored in things like Ghostbusters, where you see in Ghostbusters they're exploring things that are at the edge of human imagination, such as paranormal phenomenon, but they're doing so through what you would readily perceive as scientific ways. They're bringing out meters and different graphs and analyzing different energy waves, and they're proceeding forward in a way that you would think of science, but they're using science to explore a region that is unscientific. And this could be said about how science views this relationship with religion in a certain sense. And we see this in the recent show, Stranger Things, where we have a crossover between the phenomenon of demonology and the phenomenon that are observed through science. And in a sense, we find that science is involved in creating alternative realms that then give birth to creatures that form an alternative reality outside of this world. And we see the same myth actually available to us in religion, especially in the demiurge of the Gnostics. We see a similar display, but this is somehow sort of thinly veiled within the contents of the show, where they have various allusions to things like the Hellfire Club, and they also have different allusions to things like a Demogorgon, or a monster coming from the other realm. And the Demogorgon itself is a sort of word that also means demiurge, which in the Gnostics represented an evil deity that was in control of an alternative reality that came to influence this world. And we find that in every sense that science creates its own mythology, it creates its own terminology, and that terminology is carefully guarded through a narrow range of experts. And we see that science is built off of categorizations of human knowledge. When Aristotle first coined science as a discipline, he meant to refer to it as categories of observable knowledge And we see that in science or the arts are things that are controlled and regimented by people who have already brought knowledge forward in some sense. So we find that more and more that science is ruled by experts, and science is not a non-hierarchical process of free inquiry. Rather, it's a process that follows certain methods and certain regimented forms of control. Now, we also find this within the catalogs of religious law. We find extremely regimented and hierarchical system of laws and beliefs and a methodology used to preserve the knowledge that exists. So in that way, science being a non-hierarchical enterprise, that being in a kind of an illusion of our modern age, that it's not open source as we would like to say, but it's actually controlled by peer-reviewed journals, a narrow range of experts, and so are to parallel how religious laws are codified, And this would be one way where the dialectic between science and religion breaks down. It breaks down quite readily at this juncture, where science is a hierarchical way of engaging with the world, and that hierarchical way is involved with many subcategories of knowledge, subdisciplines, the same way you would see in a religious order. Another way that the dialectic between science and religion seems to collapse is that science seems to focus on history, and it has to focus on changes that are going on in the real world, and it has to apply its practice to those changes in the real world. So science, the same as religion, arbitrarily chooses where to exact its focus, and as a result, science as well as religion has been closely aligned to the state. Historically speaking, both have allowed the state to create decisions, and this represents what kind of what I was saying in the beginning about science being controlled rigidly through a hierarchical system of knowledge that's also split into many subcategories and forms of categorization. Science also is a top-down process in terms of that the power and the resources of the state, or those who control the objective means of power, are the ones who control. In the past, they controlled religious attitudes, but today they control not only religious attitudes, but also those attitudes that relate to science and the acquisition of human knowledge. And in that way, science arbitrarily chooses where to devote its focus. For example, most of the science is used towards military means, and the myth that science is being developed in a garage by people like Steve Jobs, and this is just like a kind of rough process, and it's geniuses are coming up with things at the spur of the moment, when actually we find that the internet, instead, most of the things to create the internet were already created by the military, by DARPA. So we see in this most fundamental, in this most democratizing of mediums as the internet, we find that it's a process that was still came to us through top-down means, and one that was only secondly given for consumer to assign a value on a level of where it was being marketed to consumers. It was first something that was developed by the state, And this is what we mean, that science is not only controlled by a narrow range of experts, but often those narrow range of experts are actors within the state. Those people that have their very hands on the objective means of power that are wielded by the state, which we know now are not physical means that are just by how many guns people hold, but no, we find that most weapons are not things that are controlled by human hands, but they're programmed by engineers, and this means that the whole shift of power goes from physical brute force to one of knowledge, and knowledge being used as a more destructive force in the form of science and technology than any form of brute force could ever surmise. So if we want to focus on how to control or how to balance power in this world, we should focus on who controls the means of science that allow them to control the technological means, and worry about the moral weight of those who control and make decisions based on those things, because a lot of the power of technology to fight in war, the destruction today in modern war is absolute. Such means could have never before in history been invented by anything other than the means of science and technology. So this is an important thing for us to realize, that science is used by the state, just like religion has been used by the state. They're no different. And science, another way is that science regards its manipulation of nature to much in the same way that magic or magicians in the past regarded their relationship with nature. And they thought, scientists and magicians believe in the manipulation of nature. As Jacques Ellul, the prominent sociologist, pointed out, that the use of magic is a primitive use of technique itself, or a primitive use of the embodiment or reification of scientific means whose project is technological, in essence. And this means that science wanted to undercut nature and didn't see nature as divine in the same way that magic didn't see nature as particularly divine, but only divine insofar as it could be transformed or become malleable or become subject to mind or an ordering agent. And in this way, there is a similar dialectic between magic and religion as there is between religion and science. And we see this also in various ways that were expressed by the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who said that any sufficiently developed means of technology is indistinguishable from magic. And this could be compared to Ellul's statement that we just mentioned. But we digress into another topic here. We'll move on to another, perhaps surprising dialectic between science and religion. And that is one that was is about the progress of human knowledge. And we see in certain types of religion, we see that history itself forms a sort of progressive chain of revelation that is part of the embodiment of the project of revelation in human terms, which history itself becomes something that is something equivalent to revelation. But here we have something occurring in the future, a sort of futurism. And in Christianity, we could call this the kingdom of God, or the particular pseudo-eschatology of progress, or of an ultimate end of history, in a sense, which we see philosopher like Hegel believed in. And he was, of course, drawing from Kant and his delusions of world peace, and his sort of self-aggrandizing humanism that ultimately led humankind to utopian goal or end. But here we see that there's actually different projects in human knowledge, but we see that one of them is indeed the utopian project, and the utopian project does connect itself with this other religious notion of the kingdom of God. At least historically it has. We find this in the Hermetic in the writings of the Hermetic Reformation, which occurred before the Protestant Reformation, and after the Protestant Reformation and before the Enlightenment, and featured such characters as Giordano Bruno and others. But back to the progress of human knowledge, we find that knowledge can progress in various ways, as the philosopher Hilary Putnam pointed out, that knowledge can progress in the way that is like a crossword puzzle, which means that as you find out parts of a crossword puzzle, you unveil other parts of the crossword puzzle, and it sort of helps you unveil other parts. The more you discover, the more you can see other discoveries. In other words, discoveries lead easier and easier to other discoveries. And this would be the crossword puzzle explanation of gaining human knowledge. That there's only a set amount of information out there, and we unveil it little by little, and once we unveil some of it, it helps us unveil the whole thing. Now, another way is a treasure chest model. Now, in a treasure chest model, we gain bits of human knowledge. Now, we don't know how much knowledge is actually out there, because we don't understand how much of the world is left to be explored. We're simply going by what we've collected, and we gain a little bit of knowledge, and we put it in our treasure chest, and we save it for later. And what we have, we're proud of, and we acknowledge what we have, and we use what we have maybe to chart the seas and to find what else is out there. Now, that is a second view of human knowledge. Now, a third view of human knowledge suggests a pyramidal structure to knowledge. That means that once we discover more foundational means that are much more broad, and we discover the abstract concepts, we can lay down higher and higher forms of knowledge, and we can attain more and more selective forms of knowledge, which are expressed by a narrower and narrower and narrower range of information as we go up the pyramid. And this means that all of our knowledge is like bricks stacked on top of each other until proceeding to the top, we get to some sort of ascension, and finally we reach some sort of completion. Now, a final view of human knowledge comes from Popper, who paradoxically enough claimed that science is never done gaining knowledge, because once science reaches closer and closer to the end of knowledge, it becomes in a Zeno's paradox of finding out that it has only double that distance to proceed to get further and further closer to its endpoint. So each form of knowledge that we gain, we unveil more and more knowledge about what we don't know, and this process seems to occur ad infinitum until all of our knowledge is simply probabilistic. It ends in total coming to a further away from your goal as you come closer to it, as you go further and further down the hallway. The hallway gets smaller and smaller, but the people get bigger. It's kind of a Willy Wonka situation. But in the other way, we have the famous quote by what was it? What was that guy that was the defense attorney? Or not the defense attorney, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Yes, that was his name. And he said that there are known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. 3 types of human knowledge. Well, we would like to ask, what exactly is an unknown unknown? Surely no type of knowledge can be measured by what is unknown. We would contend that there are only known knowns and known unknowns. An unknown unknown is a quagmire, whereas one uses an incomplete set of information to obtain knowledge of what is not. And this we find to be a paradoxical situation in terms of human knowledge. Now, how does one find out something that one knows outside of oneself? One can only determine the truth that someone in front of them speaks if one discovers it within themselves. Only what one already knows can one discover outside of themselves, or have it, in a way, become one in one with their own knowledge. So see, all truth really comes from within. And this is something that was taught by religion possibly all along, that all of the knowledge, that there's a set amount of information out there about how the world operates, and a set amount of information out there about how much human beings can obtain. And that there is a certain level of incomprehensibility to man's discernment of nature and man's discernment of the world, and another possible dialectic between science and religion, which partly we have already mentioned in characters like Giordano Bruno and others, is that religious people, they not only participate in alchemy, and science was once seen as an alchemical endeavor where it was linked with religion in a way that it was seen as an interpretation of the signs of nature, that certain elements within nature were seen as symbolic and representing certain divine forces. And we see this in the Hermetic Reformation, but we also see it in the modern age in thinkers like Tesla and Oppenheimer, who seemingly read the Vedic text and saw all sorts of reflections of their study of quantum physics within the Vedic text, and became avid studiers of those forms of religion. So we see that they wanted to gravitate towards some sort of religious practice, but didn't really know how, and didn't really know how to approach it within the orthodox methods of religion within their own society. But nonetheless, they did not create such a sharp dialectic between religion and science as we see being created today. Many thinkers during the time of the Hermetic Reformation, and like Robert Flood and others, would regularly promote mystical concepts, and also people like John Locke and Georg Wilhelm Hegel, the philosopher, would promote or study mystical thinkers such as Jacob Boehme and others. And we find also that there is a problem with the eschatology of progress, and that is that innovation, it doesn't necessarily imply improvement. And there's many forms of innovation that are not as good as things that were created before. Perhaps they weren't aware of the better designs of the past. And also, once innovation or is invented, let's say, or once the real codification of technique is brought forward, then it has the indelible capacity for misuse. Anybody can pick up any form of technology or any scientific manual and recreate something to whatever end they want to use it for. And of course, this means that innovation is it yields technique, and technique yields a sort of a neutrality in use, which is dangerous and which has a great potential for misuse. Many times the people who want to misuse things are much more motivated than people that want to protect people from misuse of things. And because the former is actively looking for unorthodox means in which to use, in which to get over on his competition, which are the people that want to prevent such a thing from happening. And we find that bad actors usually are much more interested in finding out destructive means than people who want to protect people from their use. So the codification of technique into methodology itself presents a danger, because this means that it can be recreated by anyone. So once something is written down, it has the capacity for misuse. And this is an ever-present danger within both religion and science, that people are willing to interpret and twist forms of religion into new forms of interpretation, and this often leads to misuse. And finally, we come to our last point here, which is that the dialectic between science and religion seems to collapse in the way that you could apply religious knowledge or scientific knowledge into the world in which we live in today, because the process of inquiry is never complete. And a world ordered by science is highly ordered for comfort and extremely selfish in a way. But it's completely devoid of any moral scope, whereas we find precisely the opposite problem with religion. You know, you find a world that is highly ordered to the moral capacity and is very unselfish, but has no way of relating to the mass of humanity, because there's no order. In fact, the order is relegated to one that is of a lesser to the one that is of the higher goals which the religion itself presents. So it creates an anarchistic or antinomian sentiment within the people. So where you're always waiting for the results to come in, the process of inquiry is never complete. And we find this is a danger with any open-ended system, or any system that is willing to be present itself to use by anyone after it has been codified and, as we say, put on paper. Now, one such example is in the story of Procrustes, a villain of Greek mythology, who would wait for heroes to show up at his abode, in which he would offer them the most comfortable living arrangements. And these heroes had come back from battle, and they were had seen a rough time, and they were not ready to go straight home, but they could use the amenities that Procrustes was providing. He would find people in a desperate situation and take advantage of their desperation, in other words, and he would offer them comfort. And what he offered them was a bed, and he had claimed that this was the most comfortable bed in all of the world. One that, as soon as one would lay on, it would conform itself to one's figure, and if the person was too tall, the bed would magically stretch itself out so that the person had enough space. And if the person was too small, the bed would kind of shrink wrap itself around the person so that they would kind of be snug, nice and snug. And so the people, being curious and having understood that there was magic in the world, they would go and try out Procrustes' bed, only to find out how the bed actually worked. Now, this was a bad ending for our heroes, because as soon as they laid on Procrustes' bed, if they were too long for the bed, Procrustes would cut them down to size so that they would be the perfect shape of the bed. And if they were too short for the bed, well, no problem. Procrustes would stretch out their limbs in a very painful manner to make sure that they were long enough to fit his bed. See, it wasn't Procrustes' ideas about the world that were wrong. He simply formed his ideas and then fixed the world in order to conform to his beliefs. And we find the methods of science to be extremely rigid, and a world organized by logic to be extremely rigid in this fashion. So I hope you will understand the various ways that we have presented the dialectic between religion and science, and where are the fault lines between them. And I hope you will join us more here on Holy Robots. And please send us any of your thoughts or concerns. We'd love to engage with you, my dear friends. And I'm sorry that I've left you for so long. I was writing a book over 600 pages long, and I've been working on it for 5 years. It is a textbook on the history of religion, politics, and philosophy in the West, entitled Christ Protagonist, or Logos Dethroned. I will be keeping you guys updated, or anybody who has questions on any of the things we've discussed. We invite all to debate, question, and to bother us about anything that you would like to in the email or the comments section. Please have a beautiful time, my friends.
what the book is about the dogmas that I think are constricting the sciences and have done for more than 100 years. And what's happened in science is a kind of confusion or conflict between science as a method of inquiry based on hypothesis, investigation, empirical data, and so forth, ideally free from dogma, and the reality, which is that most of the sciences, all of them actually, have been captured by the ideology or metaphysics of materialism, philosophical materialism. By materialism, I'm not here referring to its common everyday usage about people who spend too much time in shopping malls. I'm referring to the philosophical doctrine that the ultimate reality is matter, and therefore consciousness is derivative from matter, and is nothing but the activity of the brain. It leads to an entirely cerebrocentric view of consciousness that... Heavens! I was about to comment on the inappropriateness of the machine metaphor. So this very limited view of consciousness is the biggest problem in materialism, and I'll come to that in a moment. But what I want to start by doing is just outlining the 10 dogmas which are taken for granted by virtually all scientists and virtually all educated people, because most university graduates, whether or not they've studied the natural sciences, are led to believe that these are the correct view of seeing nature. And even if you don't agree with them in private, at least you have to pretend to believe in them in public. Otherwise, you'll be thought to be stupid or uneducated or superstitious. I think the present situation in relation to materialism is a little bit like Russia under Brezhnev, where there was an official doctrine which not everyone believed in. How few people in Russia were actual committed communists. Very few really believed it, but in public, most pretended to. And when rousing communist speeches were given at party congresses, halls of thousands of delegates all dutifully clapped, and dissidents were very few in number and mostly confined to psychiatric institutions. They were put there. But hardly anyone, well, not hardly anyone, but most people didn't really believe it. And most people don't really believe in materialism. Most people don't really believe that they are nothing but automata, that their brain is nothing but a computer, and that they don't have any free will or genuine choice. Hardly anyone believes that. Even materialists don't believe it, because they'd like you to choose to believe in materialism on the basis of reason and evidence, rather than believe in it just because your brain makes you believe in it because of conditioning, chance, or brain chemistry. Anyway, the 10 dogmas, which are usually taken for granted, are very rarely challenged, and most people don't even realize they're dogmas or assumptions, are as follows. First, that nature is mechanical. The universe is a machine, animals and plants are machines, we are machines. In fact, everything's machinery. This came into vogue in the 17th century, and it was the founding metaphor of the modern sciences. And the reason it became the founding metaphor was that the founding fathers of modern science were breaking away from the older worldview taught in all the European universities and monasteries and schools, which was really a form of Christian animism. In the medieval universities, people were taught that the Earth is a living organism, Mother Earth, that the heavens are alive, the stars are intelligent, that they're populated by minds, angelic minds, that animals and plants have souls. The reason we call animals animals is because they have a soul, or anima, and that human souls included the plant level of soul, which shapes the form of the body, the animal level of the soul, which underlies the emotions, the instincts, and the senses, and gives us emotions which we share with animals, like fear, lust, anger, etc. And the human soul contained a third element, the intellectual or conscious soul, which was to do with reason and was open to the Spirit of God. So the rational mind, which was embedded in a much larger psychic system, which was largely unconscious. The whole of this worldview was animate. The living God was the God of a living world, and the living world was organic and purposeful. Nature had internal purposes. Now, the machine view of nature displaced that, and precisely by getting rid of the souls from nature. And souls were drained out of nature until all that was left was purposeless machinery. Now, of course, machines do have purposes, but they're not inherent to the machines. A car has a purpose. It wouldn't be made otherwise. It's to get you from one place to another. But the car itself has no purpose. Its purpose is external to the car. It's in the minds of its owners or users. The difference with an organism is that organisms have their own goals or purposes. I learned this to my cost when I was I went to a trip in Ireland. In fact, I went to a transpersonal conference in the west of Ireland. And after it, we were offered as part of the program a horse ride around some beautiful Irish mountains. I'd never ridden before, so I was given this horse, and they told me it was a very reliable animal. I sat on it. It seemed to know just what it was doing, and I hoped it would go off with the other horses around these beautiful mountains. But instead, it branched off at a particular junction and confidently walked down the road until it ended up at its stables. And it had a definite idea as to where it wanted to go, whereas if I got in a car, that wouldn't have happened. So the organisms have purposes, machines don't. And so the idea was to drain all the purposes out of nature. And in the 17th century, the founders of modern science were devout Christians, and they thought that by downgrading nature, they could upgrade God. They thought it was pious to take this view because all the purposes of nature were taken out of nature and put in the mind of God. God was the purpose of the whole universe. Before, the animals and plants had all had their own purposes, delegated purposes, ultimately derived from the divine purpose, but inherent in the organisms. This took the purposes out. And it led to a dualistic view of nature, sometimes called Cartesian dualism, which created a duality of a machine universe made of unconscious matter. On the other hand, a world of consciousness or spirit, which consisted of God, angels, and human rational minds. And the spirit world was immaterial, outside time and space. The natural world was material.
said,